At first sight, Bob Cratchit does seem to be a really two-dimensional character who's not very realistic. Yes, of course, Dickens does create him to help his readers empathise with the harsh conditions of the poorer working classes. So he's there to make a political point. And yes, it is easy to dismiss him as a construct who is there to illustrate Dickens' social teaching and to be the butt of Scrooge's many jokes. This is definitely how he's introduced to us at first. We first find out about Bob from Scrooge's point of view, which is why we are first told that he is a clerk, and we are not introduced to his name, because it seems Scrooge doesn't care what his name is. We can also see that he is afraid of Scrooge and makes do with what looked like one piece of coal to keep warm by, without daring to ask for more. He knows that Scrooge would sack him just for requesting more coal. Scrooge describes this likely sacking totally unemotionally. The master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Dickens wants to show how Bob is the victim of a harsh, but at this stage, typical Victorian employer. Dickens symbolically dresses him with a white comforter in order to symbolise his innocence and purity. We are made to feel sympathetic because one candle seems to give more heat than the coal fire. But notice that in the darkness of winter, Bob also has only one candle at a time when that was the only form of light available. The electric light bulb didn't exist yet. Scrooge also makes fun of Bob for feeling positive despite how miserable Scrooge has deliberately made his working conditions. Although Scrooge is an exaggerated form of the heartless Victorian employer, Bob is slightly closer to reality. This is why Dickens is very explicit about how much Bob is paid, 15 shillings a week. Firstly, we can see that Scrooge knows this is not enough to support a wife and family because he tells himself such a salary should prevent Bob from feeling any kind of Christmas spirit. In fact, this is so little that Scrooge imagines Bob is insane. This is why he imagines retiring to the country's most famous mental hospital, Bedlam, which was something of a tourist attraction in Dickens' day, suggesting that Bob's extreme sort of madness would prepare Scrooge for the much milder madness he would find there. The other purpose of the 15 shillings is to get his readers to compare the 5-shilling cost of the novel to the average salary in businesses that they themselves would frequent. 20 shillings made £1, so the reader would be stunned at how much they have paid for something which is an entertainment compared to how much a worker might have to spend on their whole family for a week. This is entirely deliberate. Dickens normally sold his books much, much cheaper, but he made sure this was a luxury edition. To put that into context, he sued a rival publisher who plagiarised the book and sold it for, guess what, 1 penny, 1/60th of the price of his book, because 1 shilling was worth 12 pennies. Finally, Dickens shows how much better Bob is than Scrooge, because he's still able to be cheerful despite his frozen state. Here he makes the point that workers are possibly better human beings than their entitled employers. This counterpoint with Scrooge invites the reader to ask if they should be more like Bob. Bob is also used for another purpose, to mythologise Christmas. Remember, writing a novel about Christmas was unique. No one else had done it before. Dickens pretty much makes up a new genre, the Christmas story. Better than that, he knows he can repeat this genre because Christmas just keeps on coming every year. It was marketing genius. So he makes Bob excited about Christmas. Really excited. Bob is incredibly playful and childlike. He joins in with a lane of boys flinging himself down a slide to show that he has retained his zest for life, which contrasts deliberately with Scrooge's loss of that zest. He goes down the slide 20 times to illustrate his tremendous energy and optimism despite his poverty and despite the cold conditions he works in. However, the detail that he does not own a greatcoat but only a white comforter, a scarf, suggests that all this joyous physical activity is also necessary to keep him warm. This is a second reason why Bob chooses to run all the way to Camden town as fast as he could pelt, which is a journey of over 3 miles as the crow flies, much longer if following the layout of the streets. Dickens wants his readers to imagine the energy it would take to run home for over 3 miles in the snow. This is another way that Dickens shows that Christmas has a special magic. Christmas Eve. He returns home desperate to play blind man's buff with his family, so he runs at full pelt. Dickens probably had in mind the homonym pelt, meaning animal coat. He subtly reminds us that Bob has no coat. This playfulness conveys Bob's inner joy, his celebration of life and celebration of Christmas. Again, it helps to provide a contrast to the despicable Scrooge. Dickens has not asked for the reader's sympathy. He allows his readers to make the contrast with their own lives and then question how typical Bob's circumstances are of the poor working classes around them. He's gentle in this approach, using comedy to bring his readers along with him, leading them towards his social themes. Although Dickens wants us to connect emotionally with his working class character, he's also very happy for us to laugh at them. The idea that this pudding is the greatest success Mrs. Cratchit has had since their marriage is delightfully ridiculous. It's also a little bit cruel to the assembled children, who clearly take second place. In this way, Dickens also makes fun of his own celebration and mythologising of the Christmas feast for all his readers. By suggesting the feast is even more important than family, he's really telling his readers that their time together as a family is the most precious gift of Christmas. He does it ironically. He also uses Bob's delight at the Christmas pudding to show how necessary it is for the poor to delight in even the smallest luxuries. The masterful understatement which finishes the paragraph reveals that the pudding is very tiny indeed. The contrast of small pudding and large family also emphasises this poverty. The family reaction to not even hint at its small size is also comic and poignant. Again, though, Dickens has observed a psychological truth. People who have limited choices have the ability to artificially create happiness. The term by psychologists is synthetic happiness and is a very successful coping mechanism. The idea that they would listen to the pudding singing in the copper is a wonderful personification of their joy. The pudding is in fact being steamed, so the noise would be the sound of escaping steam. A further point all Dickensian readers would know is that the pudding is popular with the poor because they cannot afford an oven. Christmas puddings did not get cooked in an oven. This is important because Dickens wants his readers to contrast the positivity of the Cratchits to their own family Christmas. He implies that having plenty, like the readers, even luxuries, are perhaps an enemy to happiness. Having too much choice can ruin your pleasure, as you have no need to make the best of things. In other words, you don't synthesize happiness. All the more reason, Dickens hints, to give more of what you have away through charity to help the poor. This pudding soon gets followed by a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Although this sounds like a plentiful alternative, the shovel does not imply an abundant stock of chestnuts. It is simply the tool used to place coals on the fire. They may well just be a Christmas treat. Readers, on the other hand, would find street sellers selling cooked chestnuts at virtually every corner during the winter, and could happily afford to eat them daily as a snack. Here again, Dickens uses the Cratchits to prompt his readers to contrast their fortunes with Bob's. Though they have so little food, Bob is astonishingly able to see the best in Scrooge. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." We can choose to see this as unbelievable, especially as Mrs. Cratchit protests, "I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast on." We can argue that Bob is just two-dimensional, or we can think of the economics of the situation. Even though Scrooge is a terrible employer, he has still given Cratchit a job. We find out in a moment that Bob's eldest son, Peter, might get a job for 5 shillings and 6pence a week, which is just over a third of what Cratchit himself is paid. Why does Dickens give us all these exact figures in pounds and pence? It's because he wants his readers to focus on the specifics of poverty. Although Scrooge is a terrible miser, these figures reveal that the wages he pays are actually in line with the rest of society. Consequently, they are in line with what Scrooge's readers, those who are employers anyway, are likely to be paying their own staff. We can therefore see Bob's appreciation of Scrooge as genuine in his mind, though ironic in Dickens' mind. It's very easy for a modern reader to see the novel as an amusing and inspirational tale, urging us all to spread Christmas cheer and give liberally to charity. That really diminishes what Dickens wants to achieve. He wants his readers to realise that being polite and jovial, wishing everyone a Merry Christmas, and even giving their staff a party on Christmas Eve like Fezziwig does, is nowhere near as beneficial as actually paying them a fair wage. It also helps if we don't see Bob as some sort of jovial moron, a simple victim of Scrooge's cruelty. It would be easy to dismiss his relationship with Tiny Tim as an overly emotional tug at the heartstrings. Bob completely understands that Tiny Tim is likely to die, and this knowledge is so deeply ingrained that he has a physical reaction to it. He holds onto his son's hands, sits as close to him as possible, as though he can physically hold on when death comes to take Tiny Tim away. It would be easy to dismiss this imagery as purely Dickens being sentimental until we find out how common infant mortality was. 2007 research provides horrifying figures of infant mortality in London from 1825 to 1850. Then 30% of children died before the age of 6. Amazingly, the rate was similar for wealthy families. Bob's fear of Tiny Tim dying is a fear, therefore, that all Dickens readers would have felt about their own families. It is impossible for us to imagine this with our enormous gap in time since 1843. As I make this video, the peak of the coronavirus pandemic in the UK was April of 2020, where we recorded 53.4 deaths per 100,000 people in the population. Assuming that children under 6 only formed 5/70ths of the population in Dickens' day, this would give us 2,381 deaths per 100,000 people. That's 45 times worse than we're experiencing now in our pandemic. Imagine the underlying fear hidden beneath that normal statistic. Tiny Tim's death is not a sentimental thing. It is a description of what is happening all around the Victorian readers and within their own families. Dickens had spent the year 1843 touring factories and tin mines that employed children. He was horrified by their working conditions. He was socially and politically motivated to try to stop this. But instead of writing the political pamphlet that he hoped was going to make a difference, he wrote this book, and he created characters who he thought might have a much greater impact on the behaviour of his readers. This is why Bob can't just be a sentimental figure. He has to be a figure that his readers can believe in. The other reason for Bob's portrayal as a loving father is to provide a contrast to Scrooge's upbringing. Dickens obviously wants us to sympathise more with Scrooge than we did in Stave 1. This moment also contributes to Scrooge's psychological understanding about the damage caused to him by his past and by his relationship with his father. Giving Scrooge a lesson in fatherhood helps him to become a second father to Tiny Tim in the transformation of Stave 5. Many readers are also very critical of the way Dickens shows Bob using Tiny Tim's death in Stave 4, The Vision of the Future. When I first read it, I found it both implausible and totally lacking in human feeling. I couldn't relate to Bob at all. It's very difficult to read this scene as a modern reader. Bob seems to be using the death of his son as a way to teach his other children to stop quarrelling. This seems callous and unfeeling, as though he never really loved Tiny Tim at all. However, this is also a profound meditation on life. What do you do in the face of personal tragedy, such as the death of someone you love? First, you celebrate what you loved about that person, in this case how patient and mild Tiny Tim was, despite his life of suffering and disability. Tiny Tim would also have lived with the knowledge that he had a high chance of dying too, and yet he still remained patient and mild. Next, you try to make that person's life important to your future and ask what lesson they taught you. Here, Tiny Tim's lesson is to teach patience and stoicism to his family. If terrible things keep happening to you and your family, a mechanism which helps you carry on despite life's unfairness is very useful. It's worth pausing here to consider that Dickens puts the Cratchits in Camden Town. Camden Town is where Dickens himself lived for a few months before his family life fell apart and his father and the rest of the family were put into debtor's prison, and Dickens was forced out to work in terrible conditions as a 12-year-old. So in Dickens' mind, Camden Town is associated with coming disaster. And that's exactly what's happening with Bob Cratchit. He knows disaster is around every corner, and he's trying to give his family a psychological way of dealing with the terrible things that must be coming, because that's what life's like. When Bob repeats he's very happy, it's because he has learned a valuable lesson from his son, and this lesson has been passed on to the whole family. The alternative is to curse an uncaring God who would allow hunger, illness, disability, and the early loss of life. Instead, by looking to the lessons Tiny Tim's death and life might teach the whole family, Bob is trying to make sense of a world in a way that gives his family hope. And from hope comes happiness. You might also have missed that he is preparing the family for further tragedy and the inevitability of more deaths, emphasising that this is only the first such death, this first parting that there was among us. Far from being a two-dimensional, unrealistic portrayal, Dickens uses Bob to help his readers deal with their own grief. Then he wants them to reach out and help the poor, who his readers would expect had more tragedies in their lives to grieve over. Clearly, the working classes have to accept many more injustices because they don't have the wealth and resources to change them. This is also Dickens' point when he shows us Bob Cratchit in this family scene. He could, of course, have given us a scene of tears and grief. This is certainly what I would expect in a modern drama on television. But because death was so much more common in the Victorian household, such displays of hysteria don't really occur in Dickens' books at all. He's far more interested in how those that are living learn not just to cope with tragedy, but to try to make the best of it. At the end of the novel, Dickens does use Bob as a more two-dimensional comic figure, a foil to Scrooge's transformation. Bob arrives 18 minutes and a half late on Boxing Day, having celebrated Christmas fully with the gift of the mysterious and gigantic turkey, which he doesn't know came from Scrooge. This lateness is not the Bob we would expect. It is as though having a full stomach has changed his personality. Perhaps this is Dickens' way of pointing out his readers' capitalist prejudice to them, because they would believe if you give somebody an inch, they will take a mile. If you start rewarding your workers with more money, they will simply ask for more and do less work. That's the sort of prejudice Dickens is battling against. I think that's one reason that he makes Scrooge give the turkey anonymously. Now, the reader can't use that prejudice because Bob doesn't know it's his employer who's given him the turkey. For this reason, Dickens immediately makes Scrooge offer Bob a pay rise. Dickens is pointing out to his readers that their fear of the working class is inhumane. He also does this very comically by describing Bob's reaction. Bob sees Scrooge's generosity as a sign of madness. He moves nearer to his ruler as a knight might reach for a sword in order to defend himself. It's interesting, though, that he trembled at this, because in his imagination it's clear that he would easily be able to restrain Scrooge, which we see from imagining himself holding him. His fear, although very funny, hides a serious point. If Scrooge does show signs of mental illness, then his business will fail and Cratchit will lose his job. So this also suggests to us that the pattern of Bob's, and therefore the working classes' experience, is that wonderful good fortune is rare and is usually followed by catastrophe. Remember the significance of Camden Town in Dickens' mind. The joy of yesterday's turkey, a Christmas miracle, must surely be followed by calamity. An insane employer, the loss of a job, further poverty, panic, desperation. But because it's a Christmas story and because Scrooge has been transformed, Dickens doesn't take us down that path of an unhappy ending. But he wants his readers to know that that path is there and that millions of poor people walk it every day. And if you've made it this far, you might also want to know that I too lived in poor conditions in Camden Town as a child on free school meals, living in social housing. It's a small world, isn't it? If you'd like more top grades, check out the video appearing on the left.